Alienation from Return Fire Volume 2, Spring 2014. Alienation, the result of individuals and, through them, societies becoming alien, i.e., distant, disengaged, even uncomprehending, to the results of their own activity, the environment in which that activity occurs from the people who share that environment and activity, and from themselves. Alienation is marked in those of us living out systems of social relationships, which thus redirect our energy from living on our own terms in a manner we ourselves can choose and assert, and into simply reproducing and reinforcing that social system in order to attain the means for survival. Individuals with the means, intellectual, ecological, social, to create the lives they freely desire are difficult to base top-down authoritarian systems upon without the draining use of constant force. Alienation makes it possible to relatively smoothly maintain the centralization of wealth, knowledge, and power, separated from us yet raised by ourselves and many like us. A well-used example of alienation was deployed to describe private property and the economic exploitation of capitalism, by which the worker is separated from what they produce. Their power to do whatever it might be is sold as labor power, transforming it into an owner's power over them and thereby alienating human beings from their capacity to create. However, it would be a mistake to simply stop there, as Marxists mostly do, for instance. In the 20th century, what became known as the Fordist Compromise began to allow producers a limited amount of access to the commodities they produce, without, however, changing the course of alienation, now even more marked in the post-industrial consumer classes. We believe that the problem runs much deeper and older than wage relations in both the external world of habitual interactions and their ramifications in the psyche. While alienation can be and is implemented through many institutions, religion for one, with a far longer history, a more holistic example of how alienation begins to sink its deeper roots would be the dispiriting results on untold numbers of land-based cultures from assimilation into conquering empires, and the Industrial Revolution that forced a mechanical division between individuals and their livelihoods, their tools, their commodities, their lands, the separation between production and knowledge itself. Let's take a step back to a more fundamental appraisal of what it might mean to be a potentially free being on a living planet. What do you know about the trees outside the window? What keeps them healthy? What about the other animals that live close to you? Do you recognize their calls or tracks? What they do, what they prefer? What do you know about the lives of human animals that go on over the other side of the wall next door? Or the masses you pass on the street? What do they know about you? How does that make you feel? What do you really know about where the food you eat comes from? Or about what has to happen for our homes to be lit, heated, or built? How many of your survival necessities or subsistence skills are truly in your own hands or those of your relations? What proportions of your conversations still enjoy the depth of face-to-face interaction? How much of your daily environment can you navigate on foot, walking, climbing, swimming, being helped by a companion, or how much of it is necessary to depend on regulated means of transportation through? How much of your immediate surrounding area are you physically, socially, or legally barred from exploring? Why? How much of your daily activity is to suit your own needs? Aside from within the symbolic order of the wage economy, that is. How much of it do you even really see or understand the repercussions of? Would we live in this manner if we could directly see and touch the impacts that are hidden from most, in ghettos, toxic dumps, slaughterhouses, hospitals, cemeteries, refugee camps, battlefields and felled rainforests, youth jails, oceanic garbage gyres? Or have we become so distanced from other lives by the allotment of everything into categories of utility, so justifying their and our exploitation that we cannot empathize with parallel lives that become mere resources for our own, as rulers living off of us cannot empathize with ours? Does the concept of diversity have much relation to your life, beyond the array of brands at the supermarket, or interrelatedness have a meaning beyond message boards? We are tricked and trick ourselves into believing that the damming of a river or disappearance of wildlife doesn't really affect us, buying ourselves in air-conditioned coffins as a society to separate ourselves from the world we were born in. Do you even remember how to enact and express your joy as you may have in your early years? What actually gives you deep satisfaction, or fails to, even though it may be what advertising and marketing, your parents, school, politicians, or your peers tell you should do? How in touch are you with your own desires, multi-sensuousness, thoughts, and feelings? Might they be directed by social construction of gender roles, human nature, class positions, urban desensitization? Might any tendencies which don't fit those constructions be smothered daily in this world we endure? Do you ever feel like something is missing? What about your own body? Are you familiar with its cycles and drives? Or are they an abstraction in a textbook or something that simply comes upon us from the blue? Is health something obscure that a technical industry exists for and which we're objects to? Isn't the direction of our culture one directly away from the immediacy of human sensations, evidenced by inflating reliance on machine readings of our vital statistics, in symptom-numbing drugs shifting value from group play or physical activity in general into the spectacle of online games and, at best, exercising isolated with the iPod, or the generational proportion of Japanese society with a disinterest or even phobia of partner sex? Do you find that you float from one hobby, job, friendship group, or city to another, but never seem to be able to feel at home in yourself? Have you ever felt, like a comrade wrote, that the only revolutionary thing about your life is its relentless circularity? What systematically seems to push people into these directions and aren't reflected in all histories and cultures, which suffer less of the loss of personality, loss of place, loss of purpose? What does it mean to be brought up and inherit not an intimate wealth of folklore to help us navigate a living landscape with reverence, but to be left grasping for a handle on an impersonal life that always gets away from us, as it did our immediate predecessors for multiple generations in the West? With little understanding or influence, our ancestral capabilities, skills, and memories expropriated or sterilized? What does it tell us about the trajectory of this system when depression is the main cause of death in the developed world? It's this so-called developed world that we imagine most of our readers will be accustomed to, with the alienations of wage labor, claustrophobic built-up areas, an endless routine repeated day after day to attain the masses to go on surviving in the way we're used to, navigating the artifacts, mass media representations, and bureaucracies of this civilization, however irrelevant to our own thoughts and wishes. A while ago, Michel Vinodelli characterized the deeply meaningful interactions with a living earth as the cornerstone of existence, as having been replaced by, quote, overstimulation by artificial, coarse mechanical inputs through fashions, revivals, disco music, roaring toys, cult actors, events. A whole flamboyant, uproarious, and desperately hollow world. A rising wave of fleeting inputs, a multitude of fake interests and fake needs where our emotional energies are swept away, drowning us in nothingness. This sumptuous parade seems to consist substantially in the stream of toxic, hidden grudges that flows beneath the surface of politeness. In the corridors of industrial hives, it consists in the snarling defense of one's own niche to protect freedoms and rights that are sanctioned by law, in a deep loneliness which is increasingly hidden in mass rituals, in a universal inauthenticity of our relationships and experiences, unquote. We're awash with communication technologies, and yet more often living alone, with fewer off-screen friends and little real-world social solidarity. In replacement, we are given the imagined community of the market, the nation, or the virtual. What was once lived directly becomes mere representation. Alienation results in sensations including, but not limited to, powerlessness, shame, despair, delusions, hostility, social withdrawal, feeling constantly threatened or self-destructive, which are all pandemic within industrial civilization. Its outward manifestations are on the rise everywhere that industry and development have become the social norm, not just in the capitalist old world, but now China, India, Africa. Alienation is needed for how our bodies are currently regulated in ways both great and small by being enmeshed within social norms and expectations that, quote, determine what kind of lives are deemed livable or useful, and by shutting down the space of possibility and imaginative transformation where people's lives begin to exceed and escape the system's use for them, unquote. Susan Stryker. It forms a society of individuals largely isolated and disassociated from each other and themselves, despite the crowded cities, depressed, apathetic, or filled with violent and directionless anger, and we identify it in how the dominant social mode pushes us further into this estrangement. It's the anguish of the living subjected to a deathly regime, and a condition that must be struggled against to overturn the whole social order, which we are demanded to adapt ourselves to fit, to adapt ourselves to ever more limited and virtually superfluous roles at any time liable to be replaced like a faulty cog. Beneath the surface of modern life, we live in what can only be described as a state of captivity, and the neurotic way we internalize this reality to cope with it seeps out and permeates our every interaction. The loss of perspective that the overwhelming totality of the current system engenders, casting a shadow over all past ways of life, makes it easier to be fooled when we're told that it is us who are maladjusted, malfunctioning, and when the system's guardians tell us they have just the cure for the mysterious undermining of life. Yet in spite of generations of so-called naturalization, psychological immiseration tells us we are not at home in the world of social media, council estates, gated communities, artificial parks, billboards, office blocks, traffic jams, cash machines, asylums, factory farms, call centers, and other prisons, stuck in a flaccid cycle of work, nuclear families, and programmed entertainment. This is the environment our predetermined interactions, which we all go through every day, has created, yet it is created against us and our own self-determination. Our health, inseparable from that of our land base, solidarity, spontaneity, and indeed, in the era of vast climate changes, even our continued existence itself is jeopardized by our own alienated activity. The blackmail of the market keeps our habits and relationships, more often than not just delaying, but actually antagonistic to the fullness of autonomous creativity. Mass social organization is the separate power that stands apart from us as individuals, regulating and imposing on us, as the truly human scale in life is dwarfed by an unending cycle of representations, bureaucracy, requirements, regurgitating what is and what cannot fail to oppress us. The conditions of life forced upon us by the economy, the state, and technological society have become powers that rule over and direct us, not tools to use as we see fit. The segregation from a multitude of life forms displaced by the city not just unfamiliarizes us with our planet, but makes it much easier to participate in the industrial structure devouring everything. Ignore these facts we may, they continue to come back to haunt us in the unarticulated precarity of our helpless dependence, the interpersonal violence, the deadly sadness. Self-medication doesn't cut it. Reality TV can't mask it. The chatter of the crowd won't drown it out. We are under mental and physical occupation by the capitalist industrial system, leaving the firm but false impression of there being no outside, no choice, no escape. Is this really what we could call living? Division of labor. For us as anarchists, a key question should be, what modern institutional foundations prevent non-hierarchical relations from flourishing? One of the processes that contribute to the social order as we know it is a highly institutionalized division of labor. In its narrow definition, division of labor is simply when tasks or responsibilities are separated out into social roles, even if temporarily, but for our purposes, we mean something far beyond different people having different capacities, interests, or talents, which they could do or do apply in a non-hierarchical manner. Rather, the problem becomes when social systems are constructed in which individuals are forced to live according to predetermined divisions of activity and the power relationships that are the result. The deeper the division of labor becomes as the basis for social life, the more abstract and alienated the forms of interactions that go towards daily existence, and more static systems replace free or spontaneous exchange between people as and when chosen. While we're not interested in flattening all of our social life into a cycle of duties all must participate in, it seems clear that the more people know how to maintain themselves, and the more readily understandable the processes by which their culture navigates the world, the less potential for coercion and alienation there is. So although we don't imagine that, for an example, an individual within a group having a particular flair for herbalism, interest in fishing techniques, or love for music making constitutes a division of labor in the senses we oppose, the problem seems to become when there is no possibility for knowledge to be generalized if desired, and people are instead locked into their designated stations. And while it seems there can be certain divisions of labor without civilization, there can be no civilization without an enforced division of labor. We identify civilization as completely antagonistic to our desires for freedom. By civilization, we could briefly and incompletely summarize urbanized societies, which imply large-scale demographic growth and the constant need for expansion and conquest, complex social structures which coercively administer political, economic, and military power, and which are served by mining, deforestation, agricultural domestication, and the like. In short, mass systematic domination and structuring of human and non-human lives, oppression and alienation of the individual, and hence the truly communal. This has been the common structure of civilizations, whether Western, Eastern, Mesoamerican, Asiatic, etc. In essence, civilization depends on individuals being stripped of their capacity to live in communities that, through the connection of that community to their habitat, are fairly autonomous of other human social groups. One of the key ways this autonomy is prohibited is by making people dependent on systems of production where tasks are divided out into set roles, which become so consuming that they close the role player off from the whole until they can see little past the one fragment they're engaged with. Obviously, we're talking here about large-scale social organization, where it's impractical to Skillshare or generalize knowledge from close contact with people who might have a particular passion for a subject. Under mass social organization, it's more likely that you'll be too busy toiling away at some other niche yourself to have a chance. This masks the reality of a subtly violent system where the knowledge or expertise required to transcend the divisions of labor, and thus the set social structure, is withheld. Life is increasingly compartmentalized and alienated from us. A classic instance of this division of labor is the existence of politics, one of the more explicit alienations from our own power to act. This is instituted in the form of the state and maintained by politics of all kinds, appropriating alienated power to those who claim to represent others, often through permanent organized structures. Anti-politics means self-organization, against all delegation, reclaiming the force of our desires. While certainly effective, in a strictly utilitarian sense, for creating complex productive systems of specialization that enable greater control over the surroundings by the greater social order at the expense of intimacy with those surroundings for individuals. The social reality that complex division of labor tends towards is one of centralization of knowledge, and so of power over others. Some roles are given more social values than others, developing and reinforcing a dominant owner class. Privilege to perform some tasks in isolation, for instance, intellectual exercises or politicking, belongs to those who are relieved of other tasks by the labor required of others. Meanwhile, institutions crystallize around separated roles, institutions such as the state, the justice system, religion, the nuclear family, the military, the economy. This actually entails generalized de-skilling and reproduction, or rather reduction, of opportunities from a wider and potentially more fulfilling experience and understanding of the world, and reinforces and extends hierarchies and class distinctions based on who performs what, when, for whom, and who consumes what, when, and from whom. In civilizations, some forms of specialization have led to more until tasks or technologies emerge that are simply incomprehensible to the vast majority of people who are affected by them. Since no single person has the ability to conceptualize and create these overall processes of informal level even as they contribute to running them, an institutional division of labor is necessary for complex productive and disciplinary systems. In the current world, the division of labor is extremely pronounced, with specialization running right through almost all facets of civilized life, from how we entertain ourselves in our free time, or the technical workings keeping industrial society afloat, to how we raise children, or even gain knowledge of other species, reduced from understanding to quote-unquote facts. So much is relegated to the experts, and we barely have time to notice, much less question, what gets taken away at the same time, while our lives fly by through our fingers. The individual is lost in the mass as an interchangeable cog, benefiting an overall system impervious to desire. In some notes on industrial society and its ecology, someone noted, quote, "One of the essential characteristics of present-day society is that within it, we are witness to a growing gap between the activity that we carry out and our capacity to depict its consequences. Due to the extreme division and specialization of labor, due to a gigantic technological apparatus that makes us more ignorant every day about the tools that we use, incapable as we are individually of understanding their nature, or mastering their production, or repairing their breakdowns, we aren't aware of the significance of our activities. This is why the product of our activities can be calmly falsified and artificially reconstructed for us. To give an example, someone noted that it is easier, in terms of the real repercussion of the action on the awareness, to bomb an entire population than to kill an individual person. A bombed population is only whatever flash of light on a screen, whereas a murdered person is reality whose complete weight the consciousness bears. This is why the current society is able to make us tolerate a daily, scientifically organized butchering, because it renders the relationship between actions and their consequences increasingly obscure. From financial speculation to the nuclear industry, everyone can find examples for themselves." Unquote. The alienation that stems from such divided thought could be said to account for many of the largest atrocities in history, as well as an infinite number of daily ones. Certainly those we have witnessed since industrialism began and propelled us into whole new quantitative fields of misery. Jacques Ellul tells of the results. Quote, "In a society such as ours, it is almost impossible for a person to be responsible. A simple example. A dam somewhere has been built, and it bursts. Who is responsible for that? Geologists worked on it. They examined the terrain. Engineers drew up the construction plans. Workmen constructed it. And politicians decided that the dam had to be in that specific spot. Who is responsible? In the whole of our technological society, the work is so fragmented and broken up into small pieces that no one is responsible. But no one is free either. Just consider, for example, that atrocious excuse. It was one of the most horrible things I have ever heard. The person in charge of the concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen, was asked during the Auschwitz trial, the Nuremberg trials regarding Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, "But didn't you find it horrible, all those corpses?" He replied, "What could I do? The capacity of the ovens was too small. I couldn't process all those corpses. It caused me many problems. I had no time to think about those people. I was too busy with that technical problem of my ovens." That was the classic example of a totally irresponsible person. He carries out his technical task and he's not interested in anything else. Unquote. Key ideologues in Western history have put great emphasis on praising the narrowing of experience and ability. Although interestingly, apparently the ancient Greeks had great mistrust for specialists and experts, believing that anyone misguided enough to unbalance their life in that way might be useful in limited situations, but showed signals that they clearly had bad judgment in general as a result. We're reminded of George Orwell speaking at the birth of the intensive bureaucratized era of the 20th century, who commented, "Where I feel that people like us understand the situation better than so-called experts is not in any way power to foretell specific events, but in the power to grasp what kind of world we are living in." But however, ancient Greek society was largely run on the back of slaves, a pretty clear division of labor, and also spawned various cults of science and number. So in a way, the example is redundant, if intriguing to note. Indeed, it's hard to imagine how anything like our current system of domination could have even got a foothold without certain divisions of labor. How else could the orders run on time, the factories keep on producing, newspapers be printed every day, or the scientists focus on their theorizing, if it wasn't for a whole plethora of well-managed positions, each taking care of a specific item of modernity, and so enabling the overall structure to function? And in the epoch of the computer, the business people and administrators are more certain than ever that in the future we will all learn less and achieve more. That is, surrender all the more efficiently our vision of ourselves as free agents rather than predetermined machines. We must exit this labyrinth if we are to stand any chance of experiencing a life disalienated, decivilized, and accountable, one in which our actions can be plainly understood and considered, one which we can choose and shape ourselves. We could start by rejecting the hierarchy of roles in our friendships and struggles, the latter of which too often follow the formalized patterns of the dominant society they claim to oppose. We can develop our skills individually and communally and begin to demolish the absurdity that modern life has become by focusing on the forms of relating and subsisting that allow for minimal technical complexity and a healthy skepticism towards expertise. This is at the core of the struggle of the exploited, the dispossessed and the disempowered against their condition as such.